My name is Grace, and I'm 29 years old. 3 years ago, my mother called me 4 days before Thanksgiving and said 6 words that shattered everything. I thought I knew about family, love, and belonging. There just isn't a seat, Grace. The words didn't land like a blow. They landed like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I was standing in my apartment, the one that always smelled faintly of the jasmine tea I drank to calm my nerves. Outside, the November rain was hitting the window pane with a rhythmic tap, 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 a cold sound that matched the sudden chill in my chest. In my left hand, I held a grocery list. I had already bought the organic cranberries for the sauce Diane liked. I'd spent $40 on the specific gray-labeled wine Robert always pretended he didn't enjoy but would finish by 8 p.m. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked. My voice sounded thin like paper tearing. "The table seats 12? There's only 7 of us." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. I could almost see her standing in her pristine white kitchen, her fingers probably smoothing out a linen napkin. Victoria is bringing her new in-laws, and her husband's cousins are coming up from Virginia. It's a lot of people, Grace. It's going to be a very formal, cohesive group. We thought it might be easier if you just did your own thing this year. You know how you get overwhelmed in crowds? Overwhelmed? I whispered. It's my family. It's Thanksgiving. Don't be dramatic, she snapped. The warmth she reserved for my sister Victoria evaporated instantly. It's just a meal. We'll do something with you in December. Maybe a lunch? Or we can drop off some leftovers on Friday. Leftovers. The scrapings of the plates of the people who actually mattered. Is Dad there? I asked. My throat felt like it was closing. I needed to hear him say it wasn't true. I needed the man who used to tuck me in and tell me I was his quiet little bird to tell me. There was a chair with my name on it. "He's in the garage, honey." He agrees, it's just simpler this way. We don't want any friction, and you and Victoria haven't been on the same page lately. The friction she meant was the time I'd asked Victoria not to park her SUV in my tiny driveway when I was trying to load my photography equipment. Victoria had cried. My mother had called me selfish. The page we weren't on was the one where I existed as anything other than a supporting character in my sister's perfect life. "I have the cranberries," I said. It was a stupid thing to say. Pathetic. Save them for yourself. Make a nice little bowl for one. I have to go. The caterer is calling on the other line. Love you. The click of the hang-up sounded like a gunshot in the silence of my kitchen. I stood there for a long time. The rain grew heavier, turning the world outside into a blurred gray smudge. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling so violently that the grocery list fluttered to the floor. I thought about the year before. I had spent 6 hours helping Diane prep the turkey, while Victoria sat in the living room showing everyone photos of her new beach house. I had been the one to wash the crusty pots and pans while they laughed over dessert. I had been the one who slept on the sagging pull-out couch because Victoria's old room had to stay prepared as a guest suite for her friends. I was the help. I was the buffer. I was the placeholder until someone more important came along. And now apparently the table was full. I walked over to the counter and picked up the bottle of wine I'd bought for my father. I looked at the label. Reserved, a special vintage. I'd saved up for it, thinking it would be the bridge to a real conversation with him. I didn't cry, not yet. The shock was too thick for tears. I walked to the trash can and hovered the bag of cranberries over it. Then I stopped. My chest throbbed with a physical ache, a raw, burning sensation right behind my ribs. I realized then that this wasn't just about a holiday. This was the final sentence in a story that had been written since the day I was born. Victoria was the gold. I was the lead. Victoria was the sun. I was the shadow she cast. I put the cranberries back on the counter. I wouldn't throw them away, but I wouldn't eat them either. I walked to my hallway mirror. I looked at the woman staring back. Mia, my best friend, always told me I had eyes that saw too much. Right now, they looked haunted. I was 30 years old, a successful freelance photographer who had captured the most intimate, beautiful moments of strangers' lives, weddings, births, reunions, and I didn't have a single place where I belonged on a Thursday afternoon. I reached up and touched the glass. "There isn't a seat," I repeated. The weight of it finally broke me. I slumped against the wall, sliding down until my knees hit the floor. The coldness of the linoleum seeped through my leggings. I thought of my father, silent in the garage, letting his wife erase his youngest daughter from the guest list like a typo. Something inside me went quiet. Not sad, not angry, just empty. But as the darkness settled in, something else settled too. A quiet decision I didn't even fully understand yet. I wasn't going to be the leftover anymore. The silence that followed that phone call wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the walls of my apartment feel like they were closing in. I stayed on the floor for hours, the linoleum leaching the warmth from my body. As I sat there, the memories began to surface, not as a cohesive story, but as sharp, jagged shards of glass, each one a reminder that the lack of a seat had been the theme of my entire life. I remembered my 10th birthday. I had wanted a small party at the local botanical gardens. I'd already fallen in love with the way light filtered through the ferns. But Victoria had a cheerleading competition that same weekend. Diane didn't even look up from the calendar. "We'll do a cake on Tuesday, Grace. It's just easier. Your father and I have to be there for the finals." On Tuesday, the cake was store-bought. The frosting was hard and tasted like chemical vanilla. Robert had fallen asleep in his recliner before I could even blow out the candles. I blew them out in the dark, the smoke curling up into a house that felt too big for me. Then there was the high school graduation. I was graduating with honors, a silver cord draped around my neck. I looked into the sea of parents, searching for the flash of my father's camera or the wave of my mother's hand. I found them, but their backs were turned. They were huddled around Victoria, who had just received a flowers and jewelry package from her boyfriend. By the time they realized I'd walked across the stage, the ceremony was over. "Oh, did we miss it?" Diane had asked, her voice light, as if she were asking if I'd finished a glass of water. "Well, you know how these things are. So many names, and it's so hot in here. Let's go to dinner. Victoria is starving." I looked at my father then, Robert. He was holding the heavy, professional camera I'd begged him to use for my portraits. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw it, the flicker of guilt, the momentary recognition that he had failed me again. He opened his mouth to speak, but Diane pulled on his arm, and the moment passed. He just gave me a small, tight smile and followed them to the car. I had spent my 20s trying to fill that hole with work. I became a photographer because I wanted to capture the things people missed. I wanted to see the quiet person in the corner, the handhold under the table, the love that didn't need to shout. I was good at it. My studio was thriving. Clients told me I had a gift for intimacy. The irony was a bitter taste, like a burnt espresso. I stood up from the kitchen floor, my legs stiff and aching. I walked to the hallway where a gallery of family photos hung. It was a curated museum of my exclusion. There was Victoria at her wedding, radiant in silk. There was the family at Christmas, all of them wearing matching red sweaters, except for me. I was wearing a black turtleneck because Diane had forgotten to tell me the theme until the morning of. I looked like a dark smudge on a holiday card. I reached out and touched the frame of a photo taken 5 years ago. We were at the lake. Victoria was laughing, leaning into my mother. My father was grinning at the camera. And there I was, standing 3 feet to the right, half blocked by a beach umbrella. I was there, but I wasn't in it. I had been the acceptable sacrifice for 3 decades. If the car was too full, I took the bus. If there wasn't enough steak, I had the salad. If Victoria was having a crisis, which was every Tuesday, my news was pushed to next month. I'd spent my life shrinking myself, pulling my elbows in, breathing shallowly, all so I wouldn't take up space that belonged to someone else. I thought if I was small enough, if I was easy enough, they would finally love me. But you can't earn love from people who view your existence as an inconvenience. I went back to the kitchen and looked at the phone. Part of me, the little girl who blew out the candles in the dark, wanted to call my father. I wanted to scream, "Does it ever hurt you? Does it ever keep you up at night, knowing you're letting her erase me?" I imagined him answering. I could hear his sigh. "Grace, don't make this hard on your mother. You know how she gets. Just give it some time." Time. I had given them 29 years of time. I realized then that my father's silence was worse than my mother's coldness. Her cruelty was a storm. You could prepare for it, you could hide from it. But his passivity was a slow leak. It was the steady drip of not enough that had eroded my self-worth until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. He loved me, I knew that. But he didn't love me enough to be uncomfortable. He didn't love me enough to stand up and say, "If my daughter doesn't have a seat, I don't either." I sat in my apartment as the sun went down, watching the shadows stretch across my floor like long, grasping fingers. The jasmine scent in the air felt cloying now, like a funeral parlor. My father had a chance to choose me, and he chose silence instead. The Thursday of Thanksgiving arrived with a cruel, mocking brightness. The sun bounced off the frost on my window, turning the world into a glittering landscape that felt entirely out of reach. I woke up late, the kind of heavy, sluggish sleep that comes from a heart trying to protect itself. For a moment, I forgot. I reached for my phone, expecting a text from the family group chat about what time to arrive, or a frantic, "Did you bring the extra napkins?" from Diane. There were no notifications. The silence of the digital world was louder than any shout. I pulled the duvet up to my chin, the fabric smelling of the lavender detergent. I used to try and make my bedroom feel like a sanctuary. Usually the scent was a comfort. Today it felt like a shroud. By 2 p.m., the smell of the neighbors' cooking began to seep through the vents. It was a sensory assault. I heard the muffled thud-thud of footsteps in the apartment. Above me, running feet, children laughing. I heard the faint clinking of silverware against porcelain. Somewhere nearby, a door opened, and a gust of wind carried the scent of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and that specific, sugary warmth of yams with toasted marshmallows. I sat on my sofa, wrapped in a gray cardigan that felt too big, staring at a blank television screen. I wasn't hungry, but my stomach felt like a cold, empty cavern. I thought about the cohesive group at my mother's house. I could see the scene perfectly. The table draped in the heirloom lace cloth, the candles flickering in the silver holders I'd polished the year before. Victoria would be sitting in my usual spot, her hand resting on her husband's arm, holding court. My father would be carving the bird, his eyes downcast, his mouth set in that thin, tight line he used when he was trying not to think about something. He was trying not to think about me. I picked up my phone and opened Instagram, a mistake. The first thing that popped up was Victoria's story. It was a photo of the table. The caption read, "So grateful for this perfect full house. Family is everything." There was the seat. There was the extra leaf in the table I was told didn't exist. There were the in-laws laughing over wine. I felt a sudden sharp spike of nausea. It wasn't just that I wasn't there. It was the ease with which they had replaced me. I was a puzzle piece that didn't fit, so they had simply thrown it away and bought a new set. I walked to the kitchen and looked at the single carton of eggs and the half-empty loaf of bread in my fridge. I'd told myself I would make a nice meal for one, but the thought of cooking for myself felt like an admission of defeat. It felt like agreeing with them that I was only worth the effort of a single plate and a lonely fork. I sat at my small bistro table, the one I usually used for editing photos. I picked up a piece of dry toast and took a bite. It tasted like ash. Then the tears finally came. They weren't the dramatic, sobbing tears of a movie. They were quiet and hot, slipping down my cheeks and landing on the wooden table with soft pats. I wept for the little girl who wasn't worth a cake on her birthday. I wept for the woman who was told there was no room for her at the table of her own blood. I reached for a napkin and caught sight of my reflection in the darkened microwave door. I looked small. I looked defeated. I looked like someone who had accepted that she was a backup plan. "No," a voice whispered in the back of my mind. It was a small, flickering spark of defiance. Not this year. I thought about all the people I had photographed over the years. I had seen families made of friends, of neighbors, of strangers who had found each other in the dark. I had captured the look in a groom's eye when he saw his bride, a look of absolute, unwavering choice. I deserved to be chosen, even if I had to be the one to do the choosing. The walls of the apartment felt like they were perspiring with my grief. I couldn't stay here. If I stayed here, the loneliness would settle into my bones like a permanent chill. I stood up, wiping my face with the back of my hand. My movements were sudden, fueled by a jittery, nervous energy. I went to the closet and grabbed my heavy wool coat and my boots. My hands were trembling as I laced them up. But for the first time in days, my heart was beating with something other than sorrow. I grabbed my keys and my wallet. If I was going to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone, I was going to do it somewhere with actual food, with light, with life. I just had to find a restaurant that was still open, a place for the lost, the leftover and the forgotten. I stepped out into the cold November air, the door clicking shut behind me. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in 29 years, I wasn't waiting for an invitation. The streets were hauntingly quiet, the kind of stillness that only happens when the rest of the world is tucked away behind glowing windows. I drove aimlessly for 20 minutes, the heater in my car whistling a lonely tune. Most places were dark, skeletons of businesses with closed for holiday signs mocking me from the glass. Then I saw it, the Hearth. It was a small, independent diner on the edge of the historic district, the kind of place with deep leather booths and a neon sign that hummed. Today, the windows were fogged with steam, and a warm, golden light spilled out onto the dark pavement. I parked the car, my breath hitching in my throat. I almost turned back. I felt like an intruder on the world's most intimate day. But the cold was biting through my coat, and the hollow ache in my stomach was louder than my fear. When I pushed the door open, a bell chimed, a bright silver sound. The air inside was thick and intoxicating. It smelled of slow-roasted turkey, melted butter, and the sweet, spicy tang of cinnamon-dusted apples. It was the smell of the home I was supposed to have. The diner wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty. There was an older man in a veteran's cap at the counter, a young couple huddled over a shared plate of pie, and a woman in the corner reading a thick book. "Just one, sweetheart." I looked up. A woman was standing behind the counter, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She looked to be in her late 60s, with a halo of soft silver hair and eyes the color of a clear winter sky. This was Eleanor. I didn't know her name then, but I felt the gravity of her presence immediately. Steady, warm, and entirely present. "Yes," I said, my voice cracking. "Just me." Eleanor didn't pity me. She didn't give me that head tilt of sympathy that makes you feel like a wounded animal. She just smiled, a genuine, crinkly-eyed expression. "Well, just one is the most important guest in the house. Come on, I've got the perfect spot. It's right by the radiator so you can thaw out those fingers." She led me to a booth in the back. As I sat down, the warmth hit me, and I felt my shoulders drop 2 inches. "I'm Eleanor," she said, setting a menu down. "And that grumpy-looking man back there in the kitchen is my husband, Richard. Don't mind the scowl. He's just mad he hasn't had a chance to sit down and eat his own stuffing yet." From the kitchen window, a man with broad shoulders and a salt and pepper beard looked up. He didn't scowl. He gave a short, sharp nod of acknowledgement, the kind of look that said, "You're safe here." "I'm Grace," I whispered. "Nice to meet you, Grace. Now, we aren't doing the full menu today. Just the traditional spread. Is that all right? It's Richard's mother's recipe. If you don't like it, don't tell him. He's sensitive about his gravy." I managed a small laugh, the first one in what felt like years. "That sounds perfect." "Thank you." 10 minutes later, Eleanor returned. She didn't just bring a plate. She brought a feast. It was a mountain of food. Dark meat turkey glistening under rich, velvet gravy, mashed potatoes with a well of melted butter, and a side of stuffing that smelled like sage and memory. "Wait," I said as she started to walk away. I didn't order a drink." Eleanor paused. She looked at my face, really looked at it. Seeing the tear stains I'd tried to hide in the way I was clutching my napkin like a lifeline. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small sprig of dried lavender. She set it on the table. "I'll bring you some hot cider. On the house. It's a long day to be alone, Grace, but you aren't alone here. Everyone in this room today is a part of our table. We don't have customers on Thanksgiving. We just have family we haven't met yet." She patted my hand. Her skin was warm and calloused, the hand of someone who had worked hard and loved harder. I took a bite of the stuffing. It was better than Diane's. It was seasoned with something Diane never used. A lack of expectation. There was no guilt in this bite. No feeling that I had to earn the calories by being quiet or helpful. As I ate, I watched Eleanor. She moved through the diner like a weaver, connecting the threads of the room. She sat with the veteran for 5 minutes. She brought a coloring book to the young couple's toddler, who had just woken up from a nap. She treated the space like a sanctuary. I felt a strange fluttering sensation in my chest. It wasn't the panic I was used to. It was a tiny, fragile spark of hope. I had spent my whole life looking for a seat at a table that was guarded by a velvet rope. I never realized that the most beautiful tables are the ones where the doors are left unlocked. I stayed for 2 hours. I drank 3 cups of cider. By the time I finished my pumpkin pie, the diner was winding down. Eleanor came back over, leaning her hip against the booth. "You're a photographer, aren't you?" she asked, nodding toward the camera bag I'd reflexively brought in from the car. "I am," I said, surprised. "You have that look, like you're always trying to catch the light before it disappears." She smiled. "Well, Grace, the light isn't going anywhere tonight. Why don't you come back on Saturday? We're having a little leftovers and jazz night. Richard plays the saxophone. He's terrible, but the music is loud enough to drown out the dishes." She wasn't just being polite. She was offering a hand. I'd love that, I said, and for the first time I meant it. I paid my bill, leaving a tip that was probably too large, and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, Richard stepped out from the kitchen. He was wiping his hands on a towel. "Hey!" he called out. I turned. "Safe travels, Grace," he said, his voice deep and steady. "See you Saturday?" I walked out into the night. The air was still cold, but the sky was clear, and the stars were beginning to burn through the haze. I got into my car and looked at my phone. Still no messages from my family. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to check. Saturday arrived with a different kind of nervous energy. I spent an hour standing in front of my closet, eventually settling on a soft cream sweater and jeans. I didn't want to look like the professional photographer Grace. I wanted to look like the Grace who belonged in a room, filled with jazz and the scent of rosemary. When I walked into the Hearth, the transformation was breathtaking. The booths had been pushed back to create a small clearing near the counter. String lights draped across the ceiling, casting a warm, honeyed glow over everything. Richard was there, just as Eleanor promised, cradling a saxophone like it was a fragile child. He wasn't terrible at all. He played with a slow, soulful rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. Eleanor was weaving through the small crowd, carrying trays of sliders made from Thursday's turkey. "Grace," she called out, her face lighting up. She didn't wave from a distance. She walked straight over and tucked her arm into mine. "I was worried the cold might keep you tucked away. Come, I want you to meet some people." She introduced me to a dozen regulars, people, who spoke to Eleanor not as a business owner, but as a lighthouse. There was a quiet strength in how she moved, a way of looking at people that made them feel like the only person in the world. It was the exact opposite of the way Diane looked at me, always scanning the room for someone more impressive, someone more Victoria. "Richard?" Eleanor barked over a pause in the music. "Take a break and come say hello to Grace properly." Richard set his sax down and walked over, wiping sweat from his brow. Close up, his presence was even more grounding. He had these steady, observant eyes that didn't miss a thing. "You brought your eyes with you," he said, nodding toward the small Leica camera hanging around my neck. "I did," I said, feeling a flush creep up my neck. "Is it okay? I don't want to intrude." "Grace, honey," Eleanor said, squeezing my arm. "In this house, beauty is never an intrusion. Capture whatever you like." So I did. I spent the next 3 hours doing what I do best. But for the first time, it didn't feel like work. I captured Eleanor laughing as she nearly dropped a tray. I captured Richard mid-note, his eyes closed in concentration. I captured the way the steam rose from the coffee mugs and the way the shadows danced on the brick walls. But mostly, I captured the feeling of warmth. Around 10 p.m., the crowd thinned. Eleanor pulled up 2 stools at the counter and patted the one next to her. Richard poured 3 glasses of dark, spicy red wine. "Some people," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce low register, "are born with a compass that only points toward themselves. They can't help it. But that doesn't mean you have to keep following their map." "My father," I whispered, "he's not a bad man. He doesn't speak up." "Silence is a choice, Grace," Richard said firmly. "In this life, you either stand for your people or you let them get trampled. There is no middle ground when it comes to family." I looked at the two of them. They had known me for a total of maybe 6 hours, yet they were speaking to me with more clarity and protection than the people who shared my DNA ever had. Over the next few weeks, the leftovers and jazz night turned into Tuesday tacos and Sunday brunch. I found myself at the Hearth more often than I was at my own apartment. I started helping Eleanor with the menus, using my design skills to give the diner a fresh look. I took portraits of the regulars and hung them on a community board near the entrance. One afternoon, I was sitting at the counter when Eleanor walked over with a bowl of homemade chicken noodle soup. She set it down in front of me, but she didn't leave. "You know," she said softly, "Richard and I never had children. We wanted them. God, we wanted them. But the universe had other plans." She looked around the diner, her eyes misty but bright. "We built this place to be a home for people who didn't have one. But I think maybe we were also building it for the daughter we were waiting to meet." My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. "Eleanor, I'm just saying," she smiled, tucking a stray hair behind my ear. "There's always a seat here, Grace. Not because there's extra room, but because that seat was made specifically for you." For the first time in my life, the coldness in my chest began to melt. It wasn't the sudden, jarring heat of a fire. It was the slow, steady warmth of a sun that finally found its way through the clouds. I was learning that trust isn't built in a single moment. It's built in the small things. In the way Richard checked the oil in my car before I drove home in the snow, and the way Eleanor knew exactly how much honey I liked in my tea. I was beginning to belong, and that's when I met him. "So," Richard said, his voice a low rumble, "where's the rest of your story, Grace? A girl like you doesn't end up alone on Thanksgiving because she likes the peace and quiet." The question was direct, but it wasn't prying. It was an invitation, I told them. For the first time, I let the words out. The no-seat phone call. The years of being the shadow. The way my father's silence felt like a slow-moving tide, pulling me under. I told them about the birthday. Cakes in the dark and the feeling of being a backup plan in my own life. By the time I finished, Eleanor's hand was resting on top of mine. Her grip was firm. The first time I saw Daniel, he was struggling with the heavy oak door of the diner, balancing two massive crates of winter squash and a grin that seemed to defy the freezing rain outside. "Richard! Help a man out before I drop the harvest," he called out, his voice a rich, easy baritone that cut through the hiss of the espresso machine. Daniel was the local organic farmer who supplied the Hearth. He was tall, with hands that looked like they knew the secrets of the soil, and eyes that held a playful, intelligent spark. But it wasn't his looks that caught me. It was the way he moved through the world. He didn't shrink. He didn't apologize for his space. "Grace, meet Daniel," Eleanor said, appearing at my elbow with that knowing glint in her eyes. "He grows the best carrots in the county and tells the absolute worst jokes." "They're not jokes, Eleanor. They're observations," Daniel laughed, wiping a drop of rain from his nose. He looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the urge to look at the floor. "You're the photographer, the one who made the community board look like a gallery." "I am," I said, feeling a flush of pride that had nothing to do with my family's approval. Over the next few months, Daniel became a permanent fixture in the landscape of my new life. He didn't woo me with grand, empty gestures. He showed up. He showed up when the pipes in my studio froze, arriving with a blowtorch and a thermos of coffee. He showed up at the diner every Tuesday just to sit across from me while I edited photos, silently sliding a plate of sliced apples toward me when he saw me squinting at the screen. He chose me in the small, quiet moments where I had always been used to being forgotten. One evening in February, we were sitting in his truck outside my apartment. The heater was humming and the windows were frosted over, creating a tiny private world. "I saw your mom today," Daniel said quietly. "At the market. She was with your sister." My heart did a familiar painful skip. "Did they see you?" "They saw the truck. I don't think they know who I am to you." He paused, turning to look at me. "Your sister was complaining about the floral arrangements for some gala. Your mom was nodding like it was the most important thing in the world. And all I could think was, how do they not see what they're missing?" I looked away, the old shame stinging my eyes. "I'm just the difficult one, Daniel. The one who doesn't fit the aesthetic." Daniel reached out, his hand warm and steady as he turned my chin back to him. "Grace, you aren't difficult. You're deep. And people who live in the shallows are always afraid of the ocean. But I'm a very good swimmer." Instead, Richard was there in seconds, not with a scold, but with a broom. "Nobody move. Grace, stay put, honey. Don't want you cutting those talented hands." And Daniel was beside me, his hand on the small of my back. "Hey, it's just glass. You okay?" No one was angry. No one was disappointed. The world didn't end because I made a mistake. That night, as the four of us sat around the circular table in the back of the diner, the family table, as Eleanor called it, I realized I was no longer an observer of someone else's happiness. I was a participant. I was loved without conditions. I was safe. "Grace," Eleanor said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Richard was on my other side, and Daniel's chair was pulled so close our shoulders touched. "We've been talking. Richard and I, well, we've spent 30 years building this place. But a house isn't a legacy unless there's someone to leave it to. Someone who understands that the food is just a reason to gather." I looked from her to Richard. He nodded, his eyes unusually bright. "We want to make it official," Richard said, his voice thick. "We know you have a mother and a father, Grace, but we'd like to know if you'd consider letting us, well, adopt you. An adult adoption. We want you to be our daughter, legally, formally, forever." The air left my lungs. Not because I was suffocating, but because I was finally, for the first time, breathing. The biological family I had spent 29 years trying to please had told me there was no seat. And here were two strangers turned saints, offering me the entire table. I looked at Daniel, who was smiling as if he already knew the answer. I looked at Eleanor, whose face was a map of every kindness she'd ever shown me. Yes, I whispered, the word vibrating through my whole soul. I've been waiting my whole life to be yours. But as the joy washed over me, a shadow flickered in the back of my mind. The legal paperwork was one thing, but I knew deep down that Diane and Victoria wouldn't let me go without one. Last attempt to reclaim the power they'd lost. It was the first time someone had seen my complexity as a gift rather than a burden. In the safety of his gaze and the overarching protection of Eleanor and Richard, I began to blossom. I stopped wearing black every day to blend into the shadows. I started wearing emerald greens and deep plums, colors that demanded to be seen. The joy was intoxicating, but it was also terrifying. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was waiting for Eleanor to realize I was too much trouble, or for Daniel to find someone easier. That moment came in March, during a crowded Sunday brunch at the diner. A tray of glasses shattered near my booth, and I reflexively jumped, my hand knocking my entire camera bag off the table. I froze, waiting for the lecture. The sigh of disappointment. The "why are you always so clumsy, Grace?" that Diane would have leveled at me. The legal paperwork sat on my dining room table for 3 days before I could bring myself to sign it. It was a simple document, yet it weighed more than anything I had ever carried. Adult adoption. It was a bridge being built while another was being burned. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, leaning against the doorframe of my studio. He was holding 2 tickets for a photography exhibit, but he saw the way I was staring at the ink pen. "I'm happy," I said, and I meant it. I'm waiting for the earthquake. You don't just leave a family like mine. They don't want you, but they don't want you to belong to anyone else either. It spoils their story of me being the lost cause. Daniel walked over and pulled me into his chest. He smelled like cedar and the cold spring air. "Let them have their story, Grace. We're busy writing a better one." The planning for the ceremony began in April. We decided to do it all at once. The legal adoption hearing followed by a small, intimate wedding at the Hearth. I didn't want a cathedral or a ballroom. I wanted the place that had fed me when I was starving for more than just food. Eleanor was in her element. She and I spent hours looking at lace swatches and tasting lemon lavender cakes. For the first time, I wasn't the difficult one for having an opinion. When I told her I wanted to wear a dress that was the color of champagne, rather than stark white, she didn't tell me it was unconventional. She said, "You'll look like a sunset, Grace," and everyone stops to watch the sun go down. But the shadow of my biological family loomed. I hadn't told them. I had gone low contact after Thanksgiving, answering texts with one-word sentences. I told myself I didn't owe them an explanation. But the old guilt, the kind Diane had spent years cultivating, like a poisonous garden, kept whispering that I was being cruel. "You're not being cruel," Richard said one evening as we were polishing the silverware for the reception. "You're being honest. There's a difference." "I feel like I'm erasing them," I admitted. Richard stopped polishing and looked at me, his gaze steady. "Grace, they erased you a long time ago. You're just finally filling in the blank. Space they left behind was something beautiful." I signed the papers that night. The weeks leading up to the double ceremony were a blur of joy and terror. We sent out 30 invitations, only to the people who had actually seen me in the last year. The regulars from the diner, a few fellow photographers, and Daniel's family. I felt a sense of permanent peace settling in until the week before the wedding. I was at the florist's picking up a sample bouquet of anemones and eucalyptus when my phone buzzed. It was a photo from Victoria. No text, just a picture of a designer baby carriage. "Thought you should know," followed a minute later. "I am," I said. I have this feeling, Eleanor. Like they're not done with me." Eleanor tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. "Let them come, Grace. They'll find out that this table isn't just full. It's guarded." I went to bed that night feeling a strange mix of ironclad resolve and shaking fear. I dreamt of the dinner table at my mother's house. In the dream, I was sitting there, but I was invisible. I was shouting, but no sound came out. Then Richard and Eleanor walked in, took me by the hands, and simply led me out the door. As we left, the table collapsed into dust. I woke up on my wedding morning to the smell of rain, the same smell as that Thanksgiving day. But this time I wasn't alone in my apartment. I was at the diner's upstairs guest suite. I heard the clinking of breakfast dishes below. I heard Daniel's laugh. I heard Richard grumbling about the fit of his tuxedo. I put on my champagne-colored dress. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a shadow. I saw a woman who was about to be legally and spiritually claimed by people who actually knew her name. I didn't know that 10 miles away, a black SUV was already pulling out of a pristine driveway, fueled by indignation and a lifetime of entitlement. The confrontation was coming. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was going to shrink. I looked at the message. Then I looked at the ring on my finger, a vintage sapphire Daniel had found because he said it matched the color of the ocean I carried inside me. I didn't reply. I blocked the number. The silence that followed was terrifying. It was the silence before a storm. I knew Victoria would tell Diane. I knew Diane would tell Robert. I knew the peace was an illusion. 2 days before the wedding, I stood in the Hearth with Eleanor. The diner had been transformed. Richard had built a wooden arbor from cedar trees on Daniel's farm. We had draped it in white silk and fairy lights. "You ready, daughter?" Eleanor asked, using the word with a casual, fierce pride that still made my throat ache. "Mom is planning the shower for June. We're doing a royal theme. Obviously, we'll need you to do the photos. Don't be too busy this time." I looked at the anemones in my hand, fragile, dark-centered, and beautiful. A year ago, I would have replied instantly, apologizing for my schedule, trying to find a way to make them happy so I could catch a crumb of their approval. The ceremony was supposed to be a quiet transition of the soul. We were standing in the center of the hearth, the air smelling of fresh cedar and the lemon thyme shortbread Eleanor had baked for the reception. The judge had just finished the legal portion of the adoption. "By the power vested in me," the judge said, his voice echoing in the hushed diner, "I recognize this bond as a legal reality. Eleanor and Richard, she is your daughter. Grace, they are your parents." The room erupted in a soft wave of applause, but it was cut short by the sound of the front door being flung open. The bell didn't chime. It clattered. In the doorway stood Diane, wearing a sharp, cream-colored suit that screamed of wealth and disapproval. Behind her, Victoria was fuming, her face flushed, and my father, Robert, was hovering in the back like a ghost. "What is this?" Diane's voice sliced through the warmth of the room. She didn't look at the flowers or the lights. She looked at me as if I were a piece of furniture that had been moved without her permission. "Grace, I have been calling you for 48 hours. Victoria told me you blocked her. Have you completely lost your mind?" I felt the familiar, icy grip of panic tighten around my throat. For a second, I was 6 years old again, hiding in the laundry room after breaking a vase. I felt my shoulders start to hunch. Then a hand moved. Richard stepped forward. Not with aggression, but with a terrifying, immovable stillness. He stood between me and the door. "You're interrupting a private ceremony," Richard said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Private?" Victoria pushed past her mother, her eyes landing on the adult adoption documents still sitting on the judge's table. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Is this a joke? You're having yourself adopted? Grace, you're 30 years old. This is the most pathetic, attention-seeking thing you've ever done." "It's not for attention, Victoria," I said. My voice was shaking, but I forced it out. "It's for belonging." "Belonging?" Diane stepped forward, her eyes flashing. "We are your family, Grace. We gave you everything. We gave you a name, a home, and you gave me a seat at the table only when it was convenient for you," I interrupted. The words felt like stones being pulled from my chest. "You told me there was no room for me on Thanksgiving. You told me I was too much whenever I had a feeling, and not enough whenever I had a need. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a placeholder. Robert, say something," Diane hissed, turning to my father. My father stepped into the light. He looked older, smaller. He looked at me, and for a second I saw the man who used to read me stories. "Grace," he whispered. This is extreme. Your mother was just stressed. You know how she gets, come home. We can talk about this." "No, Dad," I said. And the dad felt like a word from a language I no longer spoke. "You had 29 years to talk. You had 29 years to tell her to stop. You watched her erase me, and you stayed silent because your comfort mattered more than my heart. Your silence was a choice. And today I'm making mine." "You're being a child," Victoria spat. "You're throwing away your real family for what? A diner and some strangers?" Eleanor stepped up beside me then. She didn't look at them with anger. She looked at them with pity. She reached out and took my hand, her grip like iron. "She isn't throwing anything away. Eleanor said, her voice clear and resonant. You can't throw away what was never given. You treated her like a backup plan. We treat her like a blessing. Now you have two choices. You can sit down, be quiet, and witness the wedding of a woman you clearly don't deserve to know. Or you can leave. We aren't staying for this circus, Diane said, her lip curling. She looked at me one last time. If you do this, Grace, don't you dare come crying to us when these people realize who you really are. They already know who I am, I said, looking at Daniel, who was standing by the arbor, his eyes fixed on me with a love so fierce it made the air hum. That's why I'm staying. They turned and walked out. My father lingered for a fraction of a second, his hand on the doorframe, looking back at me with a profound, hollow sadness. Then he followed them. The door closed. The bell gave one final, lonely tinkle. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was light. It was the sound of a vacuum being filled with oxygen. I turned to the room. My friends, my new family, Daniel, they were all there. The judge cleared his throat, a small smile on his face. Shall we continue with the wedding? He asked. I looked at Richard, who squeezed my shoulder. I looked at Eleanor, who wiped a stray tear from my cheek. I looked at Daniel, my husband-to-be, who stepped forward and took both of my hands in his. Yes, I said, and this time my voice didn't shake. Let's start the part where I am chosen. We paid my bills under the leaving a tip that was probably too large. Every word was a promise to never let the other person feel invisible. As I reached for the handle, Richard stepped out from the kitchen. The room erupted in a cheer that felt like it could lift the roof off the building. He called out. The biological family I had been born into had tried to crash. Grace, he said, his voice deep to reclaim their power. See you Saturday. But as I danced with Richard out into the night, raspy saxophone the air was still cold, but the sky was clear. They hadn't brought a storm, and the stars were beginning to burn through the wind that finally blew the old dust away. I got into my car and looked at my phone. I was Grace. I was a daughter. Still no messages from my family. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to check. I was exactly where I was meant to be. The weeks following the wedding felt like the first deep breath after a lifetime of holding my lungs tight. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the world was quiet, clean, and impossibly bright. I sat at the family table in the back of the hearth a month later, the morning sun streaming through the windows and illuminating the dust, motes dancing in the air. I had a stack of stationery in front of me. I wasn't writing to ask for forgiveness. I was writing to provide closure. To my father, I wrote, I used to think your silence was a shield. Dad, I thought you were protecting the peace. But I realize now you were just protecting yourself from the discomfort of loving me loudly. I forgive you, but I can no longer wait for you to find your voice. I've found mine. To my mother and Victoria, I sent nothing but a formal notice of my name change. I was no longer a placeholder in their lineage. I was Grace Eleanor, taking the name of the woman who had seen me in the dark and called me home. As I licked the envelopes, Eleanor sat down across from me, a plate of warm cinnamon rolls between us. The scent was a thick, sweet embrace. How does it feel? She asked softly, her eyes searching mine. Like I've finally stopped haunted my own life, I said. Healing wasn't a straight line. There were still moments, usually in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon, where the ghost of Diane's voice would whisper that I was being too sensitive. But now I had an internal compass that pointed elsewhere. I had Richard, who had spent the last 3 weekends helping me turn my spare room into a professional darkroom. I had Daniel, who had started leaving little bundles of wildflowers on my dashboard every morning. And then there was the new life. It started with a persistent fatigue and a sudden, inexplicable craving for the sour pickles Eleanor kept in the basement. I didn't want to believe it at first. I was so used to things being taken away that I was terrified to admit something was being given. I told Daniel on a Friday evening out at the farm. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the fields in strokes of violet and gold. We were walking through the rows of emerging kale, the earth soft and damp beneath our boots. Daniel, I said, stopping by a cluster of apple trees. He turned, his face lit by the embers of the day. Yeah, Grace? I think the table is going to need another seat. It took a moment for the words to land. When they did, the expression on his face was something I'll hold in my heart until the day I die. It wasn't just joy. It was a profound, reverent awe. He didn't just hug me. He lifted me off the ground, his laughter echoing against the silent trees. Another seat, he whispered into my hair. A permanent one. We told Eleanor and Richard that night at the diner. Richard, the man of few words and steady hands, actually dropped his dish towel and wept. Eleanor simply pulled me into her arms and held me for a long time, her heart beating against mine. She'll never know a day where she isn't wanted. Eleanor whispered. He'll never wonder if there's room for him. As the months progressed, my body changed, and so did my perspective. I found myself taking photos not just of what was there, but of the potential of what was to come. I did a series of portraits of chosen families in the community, a group of elderly veterans, two best friends raising their kids together, an old woman and the neighbor who checked on her every day. The exhibit was called The Open Table. On the night of the gallery opening, I stood in the center of the room, my hand resting on my growing belly. My parents, my real parents, stood on either side of me. Daniel was talking to a local reporter, his hand gesturing toward my work with a pride that made me feel like a queen. I looked at the photos on the wall. They were raw, intimate, and deeply human. They told the truth I had lived. That blood is a beginning, but choice is the destination. I received one final message from Victoria. She had seen a post about the exhibit online. I see you're using our family trauma for your art now. Classic Grace, Mom says she's glad. You found a place where you can be the center of attention. Don't expect us to visit. I looked at the screen. A year ago, this would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt. Now I just felt a distant, cool pity. They were still trapped in the small, cold room of their own making. I deleted the message without a second thought. I looked back at my life, the girl in the dark, the woman on the floor, the stranger in the diner. I realized that the shattering hadn't been an end. It had been the cracking of a shell. That was too small for the person I was meant to become. The healing had begun in a diner booth with a bowl of stuffing, but it was finishing here, in the light of my own creation. I wasn't the girl who wasn't chosen. I was the woman who had built her own world. The morning of my daughter's first birthday, I woke up to the smell of fresh bread and wood smoke. I lay in bed for a moment, listening to the house breathe. In the nursery next door, I heard the soft, melodic babbles of Maya, a name that means water, the element that always finds a way. I walked into the kitchen of our farmhouse, where the light was golden and thick like honey. Daniel was already there, holding Maya on his hip while he flipped pancakes. He looked at me, and that same look of absolute choice, the one he'd given me in a frozen truck 3 years ago, was still there, steadier than ever. Happy birthday, Mama, he whispered, kissing my temple. By noon, the hearth was closed to the public. Richard had hung a banner that said Maya's first seat, and Eleanor had spent 2 days perfecting a miniature lemon lavender cake. The diner was filled with the people who had become my marrow. The regulars who had watched me grow, the friends who had stood by me when I was a ghost, and the 2 people who had legally claimed me as their own. I sat at the circular table in the back, watching Richard show Maya how to play the saxophone keys. She squealed, her tiny hands reaching for the brass, and Richard's face transformed into something so tender it made my throat ache. I realized then that legacy isn't about DNA. It's not about whose nose the baby has or whose eyes are staring back from a portrait. Legacy is the safety we provide. It's the assurance that no matter how crowded the world gets, there is a chair, a plate, and a heart waiting for you. I looked at my daughter. She will never know the hollow ache of an unreturned text. She will never have to shrink her soul to fit into a room. She will grow up knowing that her voice is a symphony, not a noise. I am 32 years old. I am a mother, a wife, a daughter, and a witness. I spent 29 years trying to earn a love that was never going to be mine, and 3 years learning that true love doesn't have to be earned. It just has to be accepted. The girl who sat on the floor in the dark is gone. In her place is a woman who knows that the most powerful thing you can ever say to someone is, "We saved you a seat." If you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat of your family, if you've been told you're too much or too sensitive or always causing drama just because you dared to ask to be treated fairly, I want you to know something. It's not you. It never was. You deserve to be chosen. Not as a backup, not as a last resort, not as the acceptable sacrifice when someone else's comfort is at stake. Chosen first. Chosen fully. Chosen without conditions. Family isn't blood. Family isn't obligation. Family isn't people who share your DNA but treat you like a burden. Family is the people who show up. The people who see you crying alone and invite you to their table. The people who open their hearts and their homes and make you officially, permanently, undeniably theirs. I spent 29 years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. And then I spent 3 years learning what love actually looks like. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far this story reaches. And if you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked some of my favorites there. Until next time, remember, you deserve to be chosen.